One of the things that the CX Files really likes to do is respond to issues in the broader public that could have an implication on the customer management sector. Now, I can honestly say that in the last couple of weeks, I have never seen such an amount of discussion, such a volume of posts on LinkedIn as I did over the course, I would say really maybe in the last month or so, in the lead up to the budget presented by Rachel Reeves just a few days back. Now, one of the things that I know is very true from having worked in politics myself is that spin doctoring is alive and well, and you always try and present different elements of a budget or any type of a law that's coming up that could be contentious or controversial, get it out in the broader public, let people have their say, vent a little bit, then it comes out, and people generally say, oh, it wasn't as bad as we thought. This, I am finding, based on the response, is not necessarily the case. And there seems to be quite a number of people in the broader economy that have concerns about the implications of this budget that was presented by the new chancellor. Now, I want to be very, very clear. The CX Files is a non-political show. This is not a political podcast, but we are here to talk about the implications of public policy on customer experience management. I couldn't think of three better people than to join me today than Lian Rowlands from Tayma Solutions, Alistair Niederer from NeedleRock, and Dave Rumble, who's a longtime friend and companion with the show, and I have just found out has the nickname Davipedia. So with that in mind, those who can't see, because this is an audio podcast, I think Dave has just turned several shades of red, while Lian and Alistair are giggling senselessly. But as we get into the crux of the discussion, I want to start with you, Alistair. You know, you were mentioning that you were at a conference earlier today talking a little bit about the implications of the budget, perhaps more broadly on a few different elements of the economy and the implications on consumers. But as somebody who's been the managing director of a contact center organization or two in your time, as you look at this budget, what do you think immediately are the implications for the customer experience management space, if you were to maybe tease out two or three?
Sure. Hi, Peter. Hi, everybody. Davipedia, Lian. I think that, when I was running large scale contact center operations, the thing that was always lurking was, the basic wage. And I think that we ran businesses that often weren't that good at forecasting what might happen if they increased. And I'm sure that now contracting has got a lot better for cost of living adjustments, and contract terms can take advantage of this. But what we've seen in this budget, my opinion, appears to be a little bit of a double whammy that might also give rise to opportunity. So not only is the basic wage going up, which hopefully companies are prepared for, but what you're seeing is, with national insurance increasing, that companies are being hit generally at a business level. So businesses are now looking at this and saying, as a contact center operation, it's going to be tricky because your cost of operation is going up significantly. And the businesses that are using you are also experiencing a huge increase in cost. And what's going to be awkward out of this budget is the fact that people are going to be employing less people. So, does that give rise to outsourcing? And it goes back to the old story of, is the relationship between the outsourcer and their customer strong enough and sensible enough that it actually can ride these things, and the efficiencies of the outsourcer, can be brought to bear. So, there may be an opportunity coming out of it, but generally what we're seeing is, a double hit on costs, both in terms of the wage side, but also with national insurance.
But you raise a very good point there. Does this lead organizations on the captive side to start considering outsourcing as an alternative? And I think that's a very logical question. But Lian, as we ponder this, if a captive operator or an executive within a captive operation is saying, well, we're managing our work onshore now, logically speaking, they're probably going to think, well, we're going to shift to an outsourcer that's going to be doing the same. It's going to be working domestically. It's going to be working onshore. We want to keep that level of intimacy between the agent and the consumer. Isn't this just going to be passing the buck to the BPO community, which we know is already squeezed tremendously on margins? How are BPOs going to manage some of the implications of this budget?
I think I think actually it's going to cause some real problems if we're not careful, because if the insistence is it has to stay on shore, then there are going to be some BPOs who are going to say, based on exactly what Alistair said, this is a triple whammy, right? We're talking an increase in national living wage, we're talking an increase in employers' national insurance, and a reduction in the threshold, by the way, as well, at which national insurance kicks in for employers. So there's actually three different thresholds that this hits. And there are going to be quite a lot of BPOs, if the insistence is that it stays on shore, who say we can't take that hit because the hourly rates and the challenges of the challenges of actually a person to person, just pure outsourcing deal isn't attractive from that perspective. I think where it will become more interesting is people are going to have to really reconsider how they think about technology, and where they've been slightly more resistant to technology in the past in terms of reducing the number of employees, because that is one of the levers that is there to pull. And then it is going to kick the tires, for want of a better word, on how serious different sectors are and different industries are in keeping work and voice and non-voice onshore in the UK. I think it's going to challenge some of that thinking, because I don't think, given the impact that this is going to have, I don't think people are going to be able to ignore the labour arbitrage of offshoring anymore in the same way that they've tried to resist it in the past.
And that raises a very good point as far as I'm concerned, because of the fact that costs are going to go up, whether you're doing it captive or whether you're doing it with a BPO partner. That almost salaciousness, the idea about offshoring is truly going to come to the forefront for a lot of different organizations. And one of the things I always like to say is that I have always found that the UK is maybe one of the most progressive countries when it comes to CX. People are more willing to try new things. They're more willing to take risks. They're more willing to go to a different destination than ever before. And we can all remember the days when the UK was India or bust. And then it became India and the Philippines or bust. Now it seems to be you've got India, you've got the Philippines. South Africa is obviously a very popular option. We're hearing more chatter about the Caribbean as well, which I think is wise. It's a great point of diversification. Dave, as somebody who is really cut their teeth in the CX industry, certainly over the course of the past 10, 15 years, looking at the extent to which British organizations can leverage different nearshore or offshore opportunities. Which countries do you think stand to gain the most in the near to medium term with these implications that came out in the Chancellor's budget a few days ago?
I mean, we're we're into, and I don't want to live up to my Davepedia or whatever it was, Rumblepedia.
It's too late. It's too late.
It's too late. Yeah. So I mean, this is, the age-old, kind of circularity about where confidence in sterling is also against those other currencies. And so clearly after the budget, we've already seen a rebase of sterling. And, most of the bigger destinations like the Philippines and India are traditionally hedged against dollar. And so sterling has slipped against the dollar. And I think the expectation is, obviously, we've got elections coming up in the US as well, so some things might happen to the dollar. So I think the natural reaction for most investors, I think, will be to be cautious over the next 3 to 6 months. Let the US elections play out and understand where the dollar, kind of rests itself. But clearly, it does favour countries like South Africa. So South Africa is in itself locked into, some really difficult economic considerations, and so tracking the rand through the election and through obviously through the budget update, the rand hasn't moved that significantly, and that's largely because South Africa is faced with the same monetary and fiscal challenges and doesn't peg itself in the same way to the dollar as part of the BRICS group. So I think we'll start to see those countries that offer more opportunity for greater arbitrage where sterling can get a reasonable amount of leverage and where we can access talent. So I do think, East Africa, West Africa, Ghana, and places like that, I think will start to come into the consciousness of the buyers in the UK. And I think India and Philippines, the closer they get to the dollar, I think that probably will start to have an impact on people's decisions about how they trade.
It's truly, I think, one of the more interesting aspects about the extent to which British businesses might decide that they need to house customer support or customer experience management outside of the domestic confines. And to be very clear, one of the nice things about the UK trading in English as the language of consumer interaction is that there are a lot of options. But one of the options that somebody touched on earlier, Lian, I think it was you, and I'll just flip back to you for a sec, is this discussion around technology. Now, I think when people think about tech, they're immediately going to assume, oh, well, digital interactions, and it's going to be speech automated IVR, and it's going to be all done by a robot. But some of the new tools that are coming out are quite interesting, especially around real-time automated voice translation. That's just one example. The accuracy of some of the bots seems to be improving, quite frankly, improving exponentially based on some of the demos I've seen. Lian, to your opinion, will consumers be willing to deal with technology in the UK for more and more interactions as enterprises look potentially to scale down the live agent domestic component and ones that might be resisting going offshore? To what extent are we going to see this traction happen for technology, do you think, at least over the course of the next 6 to 12 months?
So I think we're definitely going to see an increase in technology. I think we're seeing it already, right? We're seeing much improved conversational AI. We're seeing much improved conversational design within the conversational AI and the chatbot community, for want of a better phrase. The large language models are improving. We all know about the changes in technology that are not that far away in terms of chip technology and the ability to actually provide some of these services at scale. So it's going to come down the line. I think the adoption curve is always led by the private sector. And I think what we will see is where there's been a lot of resistance, not resistance, but a bit of the public sector always lags behind the private sector, mainly in terms of how willing it is to open itself up to some of the technology that we see in retail, for example. And I think what we'll see is a requirement to actually adopt some of this technology more quickly, and to enable consumers, because consumers are now much more interested in actually their time poor, right? So anything that we can do to actually evolve this, where resistance has been in place, I think actually we're going to see an exponential change in it being looked at, adopted. It might not be a big bang, or it definitely won't be a big bang, right? We'll see it just starting to come into the consumer psyche. But I don't think we can avoid it, because I think it's the expectations of consumers is driven by the experiences they have in retail. So they're going to start to expect to see those experiences in the public sector, and the requirement to actually make these savings and meet the budgetary requirements, because lots of departments have now been asked to save, for example, 2% on their budget, on their annual budget. So they're going to have to start looking at technology in a much more interested way, in a much quicker way, than they maybe would have done in terms of an adoption curve previously.
So then effectively what we're saying is an indirect result of some of the implications of the budget, at least for UK businesses, could very well be a push towards more technology adoption and experimentation with different front-end technology solutions.
I think it'll just happen slightly faster than it would have done. I think it was happening anyway. I think what you'll just see is it's going to speed up, and it's not going to go off a cliff. I mean, so when we had the pandemic and suddenly everybody had to work at home, would we have got to a work at home situation anyway? Yes, we would have done, but nobody was prepared to take big risks until we had to. And now it's the norm, right? Home working, hybrid working is the norm. I actually think this is just going to speed up decisions that were already in the pipeline and were going to be made anyway. But the need to do so is going to be more urgent.
So Alistair, I want to ask you a question. We've talked a lot about the implications for this budget on the CX community, whether it's the BPO side, whether it's captive operators, et cetera. But what do you think are the implications specifically on agents themselves? What if you were a contact center agent, would you be thinking about as you contemplate Rachel Reeves and what she's brought to the table in terms of the financial plan and the outlook for the UK going into 2025? We've heard elements about bus fares that have been, I think the cap is being increased from £2 to £3. We've talked about higher contributions on national insurance, et cetera, and so forth. Are there taxation implications? What would you immediately be thinking about as somebody who has operated contact centers in the UK that might be downloaded to the agents and might be beneficial or might be more of a challenge for them?
It's a good question. I think, there hasn't been a lot of change over time in terms of what agents are needing, which is, to be having a job, to be paid at the right level, to travel to work. And I think what's really made it interesting is work from home and the balance that exists. So I think people are more concerned about the transport costs and getting to work and getting to contact centers if it's an in-house function, whereas work from home is certainly more economically viable. So we need to be able to support that as much as possible and use technology where we can to make sure that you've got compliance and you've got security and you've got quality of work. And I think we're pretty mature down that path. But I think it's people are generally just going to be in the same boat, that everything just appears to be a little bit more depressing. So they're just going to look at those costs, and the costs are going to go up because businesses are now going to have to pass the costs on somewhere. So you just know that that basket of food is going to become more expensive. Travel is going to be more expensive. Keeping your job is going to be even more difficult. So whether you're a captive or whether you're working for an outsourcer, you have the same problem. It's just we're heading into winter and it's just going to get pretty ugly. We saw what's happened post-pandemic, that the price of things has already gone up ridiculously and opportunistically, and it won't be going back to where it was. So already the pressure is extremely high. And so guess what? You're going to get another 5% added to everything regardless. So I think that view of the minimum wage, that's not really the biggest concern.
I'll chip in if I may, Pete, just
please,
to say, look,
please, yeah, please.
Yeah, look, I think what we haven't actually covered is that there is different treatment for public sector over private sector. So the taxation isn't being applied to public sector employees; it is being applied to private sector employees. And there are some other things that are not within the fiscal policy which relate to reforms with workers' rights. So, there are certain things now that are going to introduce, a higher need for for creativity and the opportunities to provide much more engaged reasons for people to be in your business if you're in private sector. And then you combine that with the need to see investments in technology to aid and increase productivity. So fundamentally, productivity is a big issue for the UK. And I think this is where creativity will come into private sector. And look, capitalism finds a way round these issues. But I think to Alistair's point, keeping hold of people now, you've got a lot more choice. And, choices about investing in colleagues, workers' rights will start pretty well from day one now. I mean, there's some stuff around probation. But all of the things that go into that, you're going to have to be much more creative about the reward and the packages that you offer to colleagues to come into the sector. So I think that's a hope that I have, that the industry addresses that issue first, because services is where it happens, and without customers, businesses are dead. So you want to see that creativity come through from UK PLC, just in terms of that as an opportunity.
So as we look at go ahead, please.
Sorry, I was just going to chip in as well, only because I think absolutely everything that Alistair said and Dave said is absolutely right. And I think what that's going to do, the creativity is really important. And to Alistair's point, the cost has to go somewhere, right? So it's going to come through. And I think this is going to really test some partnerships. It's really going to test some of the partnerships between clients and their BPOs. because it's great to say that you work as a partnership, and it's great to say, but we are going to have to get really creative to fix these things now. And it's going to do nobody any favors to go back to a contract. It's going to do nobody any favors to try and stick to a contract that was written prior to this, because we have to find a way through it for the agent, for the consumer, for the client, and for the BPO.
Well, this is fantastic. I'm going to end our discussion on that creativity point, because I think that really has encapsulated the fact that there are significant short-term implications from a public policy standpoint that are going to be downloaded to the private sector. And when we consider the proportion of people that work in customer experience in the UK, this is not a small amount. This is actually very, very, very significant. So I want to thank all three of you, Lian, Alistair, and Dave, for your time today. This was a very short-term, a very quick turnaround for a podcast for our listeners. Literally, Mark and I came up with the idea yesterday. I reached out to our three guests maybe about 15-20 minutes after, and with everybody's travel schedule, with everybody's busy meeting schedule, we were able to make this work. So I'd like to thank all three of you for your wisdom, but also for your flexibility in making this podcast come together. Have a great one, and with any luck, we'll be catching up after the next budget.
Thank you, Peter.
Yeah.
Cheers.
Thank you, Peter.
Thanks for listening to the CX Files podcast. We really appreciate your feedback and suggestions. You can reach myself, Mark Hillary, or Peter Ryan via LinkedIn. Please also leave a rating or review on your favourite podcast provider, as that helps more people to find us. As always, we'd like to thank Chris Haig at Traction Media for the CX Files graphics. See you next week.